Hello everyone, my name is Teknon09, and this is a topic I've been meaning to cover for a while now, that topic being, how strong is Goo? I know I constantly preach that he's the strongest character within the PTJ verse, but I've never adequately shown my full line of reasoning outside of a few debates, so I think it's about time I properly put it out there. Now without further ado, let's get into the scale. Disclaimer, the scale is based on the knowledge we currently have in the story. Like with all scales, it is subject to change as the story continues. So let's start with easily the most contentious point of Goo's scaling, that being his fight with UI Daniel. This is also where 95% of his scaling comes from. When this fight begins, it is evident Gu is on the back foot. He is unable to land any significant strikes utilizing Zalon's halberd. Even still, he is able to shrug off almost every attack Daniel throws at him, not due to sheer durability, but rather his ungodly resilience. During this beatdown, we see Gu quickly remove his glasses as Daniel makes impact with an elbow. Now, while this does not seem important, it is a subtle hint at Gu's frankly ridiculous reaction speed and just speed in general. We then see Goo effortlessly slice the room in half. Keep in mind, Goo is in no way serious or trying at this point in time, and is frankly beyond casual. After this, we get the first implication of just how monstrous Goo really is, while still using the halberd, meaning he innately is not serious. He tells Daniel that he's going to get angry. This one line causes UI Daniel, a being made up of entirely killing intent, to feel fear. So keep that in mind. Someone whose entire being is murderous intent felt fear at the mere mention of Goo's threat. We even see Daniel's eyes go wide and the thump sound effect play out, directly implying that Goo's threat didn't instinctively make Daniel fear him at that moment. Daniel then instinctively breaks the halberd to remove the threat of the weapon. Jake even brings this up, stating, is he even aware of what's going on, or did he just sense it by instinct, the danger of that weapon in Goo's hand? This, of course, leads to the reveal that Goo is only serious when he has a sword in hand, which he is treating the broken weapon as. Now, keep in mind, serious does not equal all out in any capacity. For reference, I could be sparring someone at, say, 20% and still be serious. So, yeah, him being serious, not going all out, and you'll understand why as this goes on. We then see UI Daniel charge at Goo, and Goo asks Daniel, will you be okay? Before entering a variation of a standard Kumdo or Kendo stance, utilizing one hand hold the stick instead of two. Yes, the style Goo uses is called Kumdo. PTJ really gave us a character named Goo, who uses a sword and utilizes a style called Kumdo. He knew what he was doing, y'all can laugh at it. Now, the second part is where the scaling really does kick off, right? When Daniel charges at Goo, he stops dead in his tracks with the broken stick mere inches, frankly, centimeters away from his throat, and we see Goo in a variation of the Kogasumi stance, which is another stance found in both Kumdo and Kendo. I'm just gonna say Kumdo from now on because that's the style Goo uses, but Kumdo and Kendo essentially utilize the same stances realistically. This shows us now, this scene with the stick at Daniel's throat shows us that Goo outright bypassed UI Daniel's maximized dynamic visual acuity, which we know Goo is consistently able to do thanks to Gun. He did leave scar in Gun's eyes, showing that, yeah, he's consistently able to bypass it. Now, dynamic visual acuity is the ability to see things clearly while in motion, or the ability to track a moving object. If you were to maximize your dynamic visual acuity, meaning pushing it to its absolute limits and putting it at the highest level it could possibly be at, you'd essentially see the world like you from the boxer, and Goo move fast enough to bypass it. We'll explain the importance of this later, but just know that is absolutely ridiculous. Now, in this moment, instead of simply, thrusting the stick through Daniel's throat, we see Goo pause. and he instead moves for a downward swing, giving Daniel just enough time to evade. We even see Daniel lose a little bit of hair from this swing. Now, this downward swing is when Gu really changed his style to a stylized version of Bato, which you learned from watching the lookism equivalent of Demon Slayer on the way to the third affiliate. Now, Bato as a style is frankly terrible for the situation Gu is in, due to it only having two techniques. This is only made worse by the fact that this is a stylized version of Bato, which would reasonably make it even less effective. So what does this tell us? Well, it shows that Gu was going to utilize his primary style at first, being Kondo, but after seeing that Daniel could not react to it and would have died, he switched to Bato to take it easy on Daniel. Had Gu decided he wanted to kill Daniel, the fight would have ended the second Gu assumed Kogasumi. Now, after Gu decides to utilize Bato, we see Daniel charge once more, and then the fight is cut off. This is where much of the controversy surrounding Gu takes place. When we cut back to the scene, we see Gu lying on the ground, screaming about how he was almost killed. Now, a lot of people attempt to use this to debunk the scaling, but fail to realize that Gu is very clearly joking in this scene, which we can tell based on his mannerisms and overall attitude. We then hear Gu say that his arm is broken, which is another statement people take seriously, even though Gu is shown to use his arm just fine. Logan is even shown questioning the validity of Gu's statements, saying he's pretending to have a broken arm so he doesn't have to carry anyone, which does seem to be the case. This is one of the parts of the video where everyone grabs their pitchforks and threatens to crucify me because they don't like what I have to say, but here we go regardless. We then pan over to UI Daniel and see him lying on the ground with his head smashed into the floor, clearly indicating that Gu landed a downward swing, smashing Daniel's head and causing a crater. A common argument that's used that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever is that Daniel simply fell and caused the crater. Now, here's why that doesn't work. It would have taken over 8.5 times 10 to the 6th power joules to cause that crater. That's large wall level. I'm sorry, but Daniel, who is probably around 180 pounds, is not going to cause a crater in multi-layered concrete by falling maybe 6 feet off of the ground. So yes, Gu landed a hit, and I already know someone is typing away saying, but Gu said Daniel passed out, therefore Daniel had to pass out. Gu couldn't have won. Which, I mean, to be fair, it's a fair statement, at face value, except for the fact that there is pretty clear context that implies that Gu did KO Daniel. First is Gu's nature. We know he holds Daniel in high regard and that he knew about the fight between UI Daniel and Gun, so more than likely Gu's passed out statement is in reference to the fact that he didn't really expect Daniel to go down after that hit. The second is that we know that this strike would have been enough to KO UI Daniel. Oops, sorry. Thanks to what happened with Tom Lee back in the fourth affiliate, I'm sorry. For those that don't know, back in the fourth affiliate, Daniel was entering UI, Tom sensed it, and as Daniel's eyes opened, his head was stomped into the ground by Tom, which knocked him out of Ultra Instinct. Now, Gu's downward strike would reasonably exude more force than these stomps, so yes, Gu likely did KO UI Daniel. Now, I can already hear you saying, if Gu landed a hit, why is Daniel's face not damaged? The reason for this is that the force is localized to a relatively small surface area. Thus, the damage on the surface is not going to be that extreme. Daniel was hit on the head by a stick and had the back of his skull smashed into the floor. Thus, the majority of the visible damage would be localized to the back of the head, which we never get to see. Now that we have established Gu likely won this fight, we can now climb what I like to call the Gu ladder. I know, very stupid name, but just work with me, okay? Starting from the bottom of this ladder, we have the version of Gu that we just went over, a Bato Gu utilizing a stick without killing intent. which we know is bare minimum hyper relative to UI Daniel. Like they are extremely relative, with Goo likely coming out on top. The next step would logically be a Bato Goo using a stick with killing intent. It is at this point that we start to see a gap begin to form between UI Daniel and Goo. If Goo was able to go hyper relative with Daniel without killing intent, then he would very clearly defeat Daniel with less difficulty. Let's say a high diff fight, as no killing intent is an extreme diff. This next step will be, frankly, an absurd leap. Goo utilizing Kumdo with the stick. As explained previously, Goo would have killed Daniel when he got into his Kokusumi stance, had he had killing intent. This is a very clear low diff fight for Goo, and it only gets worse from here. The final step we have to go over is Goo with a katana, Kumdo, and killing intent. Now, if any of you have experience with a sword or any form of blade, frankly, you know it really does not take much effort to cut through, say, flesh. Every quick and controlled movement with a sword can deal serious damage, and Kumdo is one of the best styles that demonstrates this. Kumdo utilizes a mix of heavier swings that can cut off limbs and quick, precise movements that can still cause serious damage to the surface. Very, very deep cuts. In fact, some believe that Kumdo is generally faster than the style of Kendo. Whether or not this is actually true is a bit iffy, and it is up for debate, but you get the idea. Now, what does this mean for Goo's opponent? Well, in truth, it means they're fucked. Every single movement Goo makes is potentially fatal, and let's say they somehow manage to avoid all of the fatal strikes, which is highly unlikely. They don't get their limbs cut off, they don't get their throat sliced, they don't get stabbed through the chest. They avoid all of it, and they only get those nice, clean cuts from the katana. Pretty deep cuts, and have some bleeding going on, but they're not necessarily fatal. Yet. Eventually, those wounds will begin to add up, and blood loss will start to take effect, leading to a very common thing that we know as shock, which would lead to, them at best passing out or slowing down extremely, which would then, lead to Goo just, killing them, or they'll outright die. One of the two. So either way, Goo's opponent is screwed. Now, you can already hear everyone bringing up the obvious elephant in the room. What about James Lee? Doesn't he have invis attacks? Wouldn't he be able to just blitz Goo? Well, about that. Remember when I showed how Goo bypassed UI Daniel's maximized dynamic visual acuity, and how maximizing your dynamic visual acuity would work? Yeah, UI essentially functions as a direct counter to invisible attacks, as it slows them down, essentially removing the primary components. The only thing you need to worry about is the blind spot thing, but that's not going to be too hard to deal with if the attacks aren't coming at you at a blinding speed. And Goo was able to bypass it with his swordsmanship. This means, and it's going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but it is true, at bare minimum, Goo's current attack speed at this point in the story with a sword is going to be about equal to James Lee's invis attacks. Especially seeing as UI Daniel and James are narratively meant to be relative, with the amount of parallels that they have, the same techniques, all this stuff, building up, the hype of them being perfect. Narratively, they are innately meant to be essentially equals, with, you can argue, one edging out of the other. Personally, I say James Lee edges out, but that's just me. So yes, not even James Lee himself, the legend of the first gen, is safe from a blonde asshole with a sword. Now, this final point of contention we will go over is Gun's statement in his fight with UI Daniel, as many use this to say that Tom Lee beats Goo, and I can see where they are coming from. It is an easy statement to misinterpret. Gun's statement is specifically referencing how he felt when he fought Tom 3 years ago. The fear and the power he sensed back then with Tom is the same feeling he is getting in this fight with UI Daniel. He's saying that a far weaker version of himself got this same feeling from Tom Lee as his current self is getting from UI Daniel. Thus, this statement should not be used to put Tom above Gun Goo, UI Daniel, etc. Hell, Tom even implies direct inferiority to Gun and Goo himself. Even though he hasn't fought them in 3 years, he outright questions if he'd be able to deal with them knowing their rate of growth. We also know that Goo is incredibly confident in his ability to kill Tom with a shovel. Meaning that this is a Goo who does not have a sword. He really wouldn't be serious, but he's confident he would be able to kill Tom Lee with a shovel. And we know Goo's confidence definitely has a lot of validity. So no, Tom Lee is not above Goo, not above Gun, not above UI Daniel. Frankly, he isn't even top 10 in the verse. Now, there you have it. The complete Goo scale. I know I glossed over some things, but I didn't exactly want to make this video over an hour long. Regardless, I hope you all understand where I'm coming from now, and hopefully some of you agree with me. If you have any contentions with what I've put forward, I would be more than happy to go over it. Anyways, thank you guys for watching the video, and I hope you all enjoyed.